So much, everyone, for being here for this very special event. Um, Several months ago, I actually had the privilege of visiting the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And I was so moved by being on this plantation and learning about the history, and most importantly, actually, speaking to the members of the interpretive staff, a couple of them, as I was leaving, and hearing about how much they care about this institution and what brought them here in the first place. And as you'll hear from Ashley Rogers, who is the executive director of the Whitney Plantation, the Plantation Museum is actually a very special institution because it is the only institution, the only museum on a former plantation site that is focused solely on the experiences of the people enslaved there, which is very different from other museums in the region on these former plantation sites. So I'm very excited to introduce you tonight to Ashley Rogers, the executive director, who will be speaking a bit about the Whitney Plantation, and then she will be introducing two of the two speakers of ours on the interpretive staff at the Whitney Plantation. And then finally, at the end, there will be time for questions.
All right. Let's see. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ashley Rogers. I'm the executive director of the Whitney Plantation. Whitney Plantation has been a museum and memorial since 2014 when we opened to the public, and I've been with the museum for that entire time. I'm gonna just share. Oh, can I screen share? I need permission.
Yes.
And it is just past dinner time, so I have two very active dogs behind me. They are my co-stars in every Zoom presentation, so you'll have to forgive them being excited. All right. Okay, so Whitney Plantation is situated on a historical sugarcane, indigo, and rice plantation. And the plantation is unique not only because of its interpretive focus, which is entirely on the lives of enslaved people, but also because of it's the memorial aspect. So what you're seeing here in this in the video with this aerial view is actually a memorial that's dedicated to all of the people who were enslaved in the state of Louisiana for the first 100 years of slavery in the state. We are a nonprofit institution, which is also a little unusual for plantation museums. So this is just our board of directors that governs us. And the plantation itself is comprised of 16 original buildings, including the original owner's home, which you're seeing here, which was built in 1790. And the plantation was occupied until 1975. So I believe that Harriet may talk a little bit to that, but 220 years people lived on the site. And so the buildings that still exist date back as early as 1790 and as late as the 1950s. We have also original slave cabins on the site. These are cabins where enslaved people lived during the time of slavery prior to 1865, but in many cases, these were also still occupied after the period of slavery when the site was operating as a wage labor site until 1975. The large kettles that you see there are sugar kettles, which were used for processing the sugar cane. So again, we have memorials here at the site. This is in the Field of Angels, which is a memorial dedicated to enslaved children who died in St. John the Baptist Parish, our county, during a 40-year period leading up to the time of the Civil War. The memorials were created by a variety of artists before we opened to the site to the public. And principally, people come to the site now and do an audio tour, and it allows a bit more private reflection on the grounds. Previously, we only did guided tours, but we've shifted things around and we're kind of changing our interpretive strategy a little bit, moving into a different way of doing interpretation at the site. Oh, I'll stop there. This is this is recycled. This is before we were open to the public and we were unpacking boxes, so we don't need to talk about that. But I'm going to introduce our interpreters here who are joining us today. Ali Johnson and Harriet Farnell, who got married last year, and I'm still getting used to her new last name. So Ali has been with us for a very long time. He's been at the site for 5 years. 5 years, maybe next to me, our longest running, maybe next to Dr. Seck, our longest running employee. And he's an interpreter for a very long time and has just moved up to a new position, a more administrative position. We're so excited about that. And Harriet started at the site 2 years ago. Is that right? 2 years. And so she's been doing an excellent job doing tours for the site as well. Both of them are very, very skilled and members of the local community. So I will turn it over to them.
Just before we start with that, I just want to give a couple of guidelines for us. We will not be speaking about contemporary politics. We have prepared some questions that I will be moderating, and Ali and Harriet will have the choice to answer as they wish. And at the end, like I said, we'll ask some Q&A, and we all have the opportunity to participate and ask some questions. I just want to make sure that we keep our questions in line with the point of this talk. We are talking about oppression from the perspective of descendants. We are talking about interpreting history, but please let's stay away from comparing suffering. As we spoke about in some earlier events, suffering cannot be compared, as well as obviously please be considerate in your questions. And this is truly an honor to have Ali and Harriet here. So now I will start with some questions. Are you ready? Are you guys ready? Ali, Harriet?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so my first question is, what is the history of the Whitney Plantation? You guys can choose to answer. Do you want to answer one by one, or would you prefer, or would you prefer one of you guys answers that question? You can decide amongst yourselves.
Go ahead, Harriet. I'll give her the first one.
Okay. Oh, Harriet, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry, just the little mute button at the bottom. Oh.
Okay.
Sorry, there you go. There you
okay. Go. Yeah, I was about to say, Ali, you can go since you've been here the longest. You heard me?
I think he wants you to
go. History of the plantation
itself.
Yeah.
I think he wants you to go.
Yeah, he asked a question. He keep freezing up. He asked you a question.
Oh, sorry. What's the question?
I asked about the history of the plantation itself.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well,
just a brief history. If you could tell us a little bit about it.
Was founded 1752 by the Haydell family. It started off as a rice plantation, indigo plantation. Indigo, first cash crop used for blue and purple dyes at the time. When it began to lose its profitability, there was a transition over to sugarcane farming in the area. And it continued to be that until 1975. And it started by, I don't know how in depth you want me to go on the history of the property itself. But that's basically the nuts and bolts of it. People are, the enslaved labor carries the burden. These people come as indentured servants on contracts to be able to take ownership of the land after a period of 3 years. And that's basically it.
Okay, so now that we're talking a little bit about the people who were enslaved on the plantation, I'm wondering, what were the working conditions and day-to-day life like on a sugarcane plantation, on the Whitney plantation, and specifically, Harriet, do you wanna take that question?
Yes, I'm assuming that the conditions was very harsh, especially the type of work that they did, with the sugarcane, growing the sugarcane, and also cooking the cane was very harsh for them. Most of the times the enslaved were sold. You may have like in the home, the plantation home. Can't even get it out. But anyway, they was mostly sold. So you may have had a family member sold, a father, a mother, or a child. So it's never a person that was in one of those homes that were together as a family. It was always separated. So it was different ways. The life expectancy was only 10 years of the harsh work that they received.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit about how the enslaved people may have resisted at that time? Obviously, they were under, terrible working conditions. I'm wondering, did they ever try and run away? Where would they go? And what were the repercussions if they were caught?
Well, at this particular plantation, we don't have no idea of knowing if they had any runaways, but there were some at others, but not this particular one.
And if they ran away, where would they go?
They have
Where would they
most of the time they don't have nowhere to go, because if you on a plantation for some time, you just in that vicinity, so you don't know where to go.
Also,
right. Yeah, Ali, do you want to add something?
Resistance came in a lot of different forms.
Mm-hmm.
We often think of resistance as just being, rising up with weapons and things like that. But resistance came in all kinds of forms. It's a business. And so you disrupt production, fake sickness, runaway, of course. There's all kinds of ways that resistance occurs besides, just rising up with arms.
Mm-hmm.
And even today we say usually when you want to hurt somebody, the worst way, you hit them in the wallet. And so enslaved people did all kinds of things like that, to show resistance,
right?
Refusal to work.
Was there also internal resistance, spiritual resistance? Was that also present on these sites?
Yeah. So far as spiritual, usually when you want to oppress somebody, you strip them of all things native to them. And so native beliefs is one of them. And they did do things like, try to hold on to their native cultures, their native beliefs, native rituals. Mm-hmm. So of course, all kinds of resistance also occurred in that form, fighting to hold on to what is your native belief, your native culture.
I see. Harriet, is there anything that you would like to add to that, or?
No.
You like the end? Great. So something that I was wondering a lot about when I visited the site was after 1865, when slavery was abolished, many African Americans continued to labor on former plantation sites. I learned at the Whitney plantation. Can you speak about some of the challenges that they faced when or if they decided to leave? What was going on at that time when slavery was technically abolished? What was happening there on these plantations for the enslaved people?
Well, like I said, a lot of them didn't have nowhere to go, but if they stayed, it was like when they were slaves at that time, it was like slave labor that they had. But then after that, when it was for them to stay, it became a paid labor where they got paid for what they did. This brought it all the way up into time during the sharecropping time as well.
And that's also like when you see the next phase, the system kind of continued just in a different way.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Were they getting paid?
With the entrapment, the financial bondage to the country store, which is on our tourist stop number 3. And so when slavery ends, these people have been on the plantation their entire life. As Harriet was alluding to earlier, they often don't have biological relatives there with them. They don't know where their biological relatives are. There's no support system outside of that plantation. And so where do you go? Your whole life you've been here doing this job. Where do you go to get a job? What else do you go to do? And the plantation owners basically take advantage of that. So a lot of times people question and ask, well, slavery's over. Why did they stay? Well, do you just pick up and go to New York, move to New York with no money, don't know anybody, nowhere to stay, no job? No. And so you are kind of boxed in to that place, and that's where that financial bondage is able to be put in. That system is put into place to hold them there. And so you stay here where you have a cabin to live in. It's not anything, but you have a cabin to live in. Right. You have a job to do, and you get everything you need from this store, but you wind up in debt to the store, which then puts you into a financial bondage, because according to the law, you can't leave the property if you owe them a debt.
Right.
And you're dealing with people that are illiterate. Mm-hmm. For the most part, they're illiterate. They can't read and write, and everything in the store is extremely overpriced. And so it becomes a financial bondage.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
even a very good book. It's not a nonfiction, but very good book that kind of gets into that side of the story is The Warmth of Other Suns, where it talks about how people, the gist of the story is people sneaking away from the South in the Jim Crow laws, going up north, going out west to try to take factory jobs. But even when they leave these plantations, slavery's over, but they have to sneak away in the dead of night and let anybody know that you were preparing to pick up with your family and leave.
Right.
Even at our site, there's records of people who are working on the plantation as sharecroppers. And even if they go and work, if they're allowed in the off season when work is slow on the plantation, to go and take jobs in other places in the surrounding areas, when the work is back on at the plantation would simply write a letter and send it out there to the job where they're working. Send our workers back. We need them now.
Mm-hmm. So slave labor became wage labor, and then they got into debt.
Wow.
Once you're in debt to this store, if you can't read or write, then how do you know how much you owe him?
Mm-hmm. True.
When he holds up his ledger and says, you haven't made enough money, you owe us this much money, and you're illiterate, how do you know whether he's telling you the truth or not?
Right.
And so you are then in turn kept in a financial bondage. And that's not a system that's unique to the South. That's not a system that's unique to African Americans. It's basically the same thing with the coal miners, and other people around the country being indebted to the company store.
Mm. Wow. Oh, I think we may have lost him a little bit. He froze. Did you want to say anything else, Ali? I think you froze for a minute. Good. That's so fascinating, and really very interesting what you're telling us about here and about the location itself and the Whitney Plantation and the history of the Whitney Plantation. Now I'd like to shift the focus a little bit to you both. What brought you to the plantation, and maybe some of your family's stories and histories, if you'd like to share. So my first question is, what brought you to work at the Whitney Plantation Museum? I'd like to actually for both of you to answer the question. So can we start with Ali?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And then Hannah.
I actually ended up at Whitney because a friend of mine was already working there. And, she was aware of me being interested in the history and knowing something about it, my family's history. Both of us having gone to school together and, grew up in this parish. And so she kept asking me about coming over there and filling out an application. And I was resistant at first because honestly, when she said plantation, I was just turned off.
Why?
When she said plantation, I was not interested whatsoever. I didn't know anything about Whitney. I didn't know what they were doing there. I just knew that the plantation tours I went on in school was not what I wanted to go be a part of.
Wow.
And finally, she would ask me every time she would see me in the store anywhere, she'd tell me, Ali, I'm telling you, you need to come over here and fill out this application. You're perfect for this job. And I just wouldn't do it. I was like, nah, I'm okay. I'm okay. And finally she's like, well, come take a tour. She said, I'll pay for it. And she said, take the tour. And when it's over, if you like what you heard, get an application. And she said, if you don't, just leave and I'll never ask you about it again. And I came and I took the tour, and that was, as Ashley said a little while ago, over 5 years ago.
Can I ask you, Ali, when you said, you know, the word plantation really turned you off and the plantation tours you had done in school was not something you really wanted to work for, can you tell us a little bit, what do other plantation museums, sites look like that's different from the Whitney plantation?
The one thing that's deceptive about all plantations is the way they look. They're
okay,
beautiful. The houses are painted up real nice. There's all kinds of landscaping and beautiful flowers. It smells so good out there. The grass is all green. And I mean, when you get into the history of slavery, you know that they didn't really look like that in those days. But also the other plantation tours are basically a tour of the house. You know, they bought this from here, they had this from there, and they drank this kind of wine, and you know, they made this much money, and they don't mention at all how they did it. You know, you go to these tours and you hear them glorify these people, but they don't mention anything about all the horrible things that they did to acquire that wealth, you know, to be able to afford all those nice things, those pretty carriages and the beautiful dresses and stuff. And so it's like a lot of romanticizing what is actually the tragedy of my ancestors. What my ancestors know to be nothing but horror. And I thought that's what Whitney was, you know, just another house plantation tour. But after visiting and seeing that it was focused on the enslaved people and what they endured, I felt like that was something I definitely wanted to be a part of.
Wow.
That somebody was actually, you know, really, there's so many misconceptions and so many things that are said about the enslaved people that aren't true. You know, even in our normal curriculums in school, a lot of information is not the complete information. You know, and we're told all kinds of things that are counter to what they really were. You know, even so much as, and I was guilty of this prior to, you know, becoming employed at Whitney, is calling the people slaves. You know, because we when we say the slaves, we infer that that's all they were. Don't give them their humanity that they deserve. And so even coming to work there and learning that we should refer to them as much as possible as enslaved people, because they were people. Right. Every one of them were people. And to call them slaves is just to put them in a little box and contribute to that dehumanization that they endured so much of while they were alive. And so most important thing to me about working at Whitney is getting the narrative out, the real narrative out, that these weren't subhuman people. They weren't ignorant, they weren't illiterate, you know, they weren't savages, and that they were human beings just like the rest of us.
It's almost like we can contribute to we can still contribute to the dehumanization now. So we have to be intentional with how we memorialize and how we remember and how we educate to make sure that that doesn't continue to happen even today. Interesting that I think you're bringing up even that we have some power today in how we speak about these people and remember them, which I think is very powerful.
It is, and we do, you know, and that's one of the great things about working at Whitney is that you're able to, you know, make people aware of that power that they have. Wow. And, you know, to get them to use it in that right way, you know, for the right purpose.
Harriet, I'd love to turn to you now. What brought you to work at the Whitney Plantation Museum? I think when we first met, you told me a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more of the story of how you got there.
Well, my interest in working there is knowing about, about the history of it. And knowing that my grandfather lived right next to the plantation, and I had a great grandfather live right across the street from the plantation. And I knew it was something of them working there on the plantation itself. Coming there as a little girl, I have never even seen the Whitney plantation because they may have had, grass was grassy up where I couldn't see it because the house was right next door to the plantation. And every time we would drive down, to come see my family, I would always see that store. And my grandfather lived like cattle corner to the store. Again, my great grandfather lived right cattle corner from the store where it was. So my interest was wanting to know what was going on. And when I finally got in and had my interview, it's like I fell into a gold mine. My director asked me to, walk around and look through the museum and, things like that. And as I looked and seen pictures, I seen a picture of my grandfather. And I was like, this is my grandfather. Why is his picture here? And she was like, your grandfather? And I said, yeah, this is my grandfather. So the next day, Ashley wanted to see me, brought me upstairs, and she opened up the computer, and there was a history of different histories of my grandfather, things that he did and different things like that. So I just did more research, and we got into interviews with people that have been on the plantation during that time. A lot of them, most of them passed away. Some of them like maybe in the 80s or 90s, can't remember too much of went on, but we got a little bit interview of what went on during that time. But it was very, very interesting seeing that and how I recognized that photograph. My mother had that same photograph. Her sisters had the same photograph. So that's why I recognize the photograph just like that.
And your grandfather or great grandfather was working on the plantation?
I learned that my grandfather was working on a plantation. He worked on a tractor. They were still doing sugarcane at the time, but this was a little bit different. It was working on tractors and different things like that. During slavery, it was different. Everything was done by hand.
But this plantation was still functioning
Mm-hmm.
all that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is an amazing story.
It was a working plantation until 1975.
1975.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this leads very well into the next question, which is, what does it mean to both of you to be interpreters at the same plantation or near? I think, Ali, you told me that some of your ancestors were actually people who worked on plantations in the surrounding areas, not on the Whitney plantation itself, but in the surrounding area. So what does it mean to you to be an interpreter at the site or near where your direct ancestors were enslaved? How does that legacy, how does that feel to you? What does that mean to you? Should we go Ali and then Harriet again?
I'll go first.
You'll go first. Perfect.
Okay, it means a lot to me because like I was just saying about my grandfather, it really means a lot to me. Because when I saw this photograph, I called my aunt, which is his daughter. And I was explaining to her all excited and saying, y'all need to come see this, your daddy on the wall. And she was like wondering, what is going on? What are you telling me? Who on the wall? And then I explained to her, I said, I work at the Whitney plantation and, I see grandpa on the wall and different things like that. And they did come out to see it. But it means so much to me just seeing that. So much to me. It makes me also think about now as a little girl, I was at this house, not even knowing years past that I was going to wind up working at this very plantation that he once worked on,
Does it make you feel closer to your family?
It does, because I share with them all the time, what I'm doing and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds also incredibly meaningful that you're so empowered on this site where they were disempowered. Really. How about you, Ali? What does it mean to you to be an interpreter on a plantation near the one where your ancestors were enslaved?
I think it's very important, and it means a lot to me. Not just for my family, but just to tell the story of our ancestors, period. My tie to the property is the Antioch Baptist Church, which comes from Paulina, and it's the church of my daddy's side of the family. My daddy's side of the family is still active members of that congregation. And when that church was destroyed and they built a new church, I just always thought, because I belong to another church, and so I always thought, well, they just tore the old church down and stuff. But when I got to Whitney that day to take the tour, and I walked out that back door, and the first thing I saw was Antioch, that really meant a lot to me, that history was preserved. To bring my aunties and my dad there for a tour, and for them to be able to walk into the church and see that it was there and restored, still usable, to see how emotional they got, that their house of worship was still, their original house of worship was still standing, and being taken care of, means a lot. My grandfather was a sharecropper. Both of my grandfathers were sharecroppers. My dad worked on a sugarcane plantation every day after school until he got drafted to go to Vietnam. And so to be able to, tell their story and share their history with people and keep alive the memory of what they experienced, also to tell it to our young generation who oftentimes don't have any idea about what things people have suffered and endured from, to have the little rights and stuff and opportunities that they have today is probably most important. I prior to the pandemic, I really loved doing school groups for that reason, because so many of our young people just don't have any idea. When you see them and they come there and you start talking and they're actually listening to you, when teachers tap you on the shoulder and say, he never listens, she never listens, they're listening. That's a really good feeling. And hopefully that, you can plant a seed in one of them, that if they are kind of wavering a little bit, that the seed you plant might be the one that grows one day and keeps them on the straight and narrow. It helps them to better themselves. It's just really important that not just African American people, but all Americans know the history.
Yeah.
It's integral, it's key to solving a lot of problems that still, hinder our society today. When we know something about each other, it brings us better understanding, of one another. And so we shouldn't just know one set of people's history. We should know all people's history. This is part of American history, and the story needs to be told just like everyone else.
History as well.
Right.
Though, I mean, also the whole world was in the transatlantic slave trade, not just the United States. It was a worldwide endeavor that brought it about and sustained it as well. So I really would take it further and say even the whole world needs to learn about this history. I relate to what you're saying, in that even visiting the plantation and speaking to you both really made a large impact on me, to the point where I was speaking about it to all of my friends and family, I think, for the next month or two afterwards. So it definitely makes an impact, a deep impact on the people who come and get to hear from you. But I picked up a little bit what you were saying about students not necessarily knowing this history. I'm wondering, when you were growing up, did you speak about the general history of slavery in your home? Was it taught in school? And now, how widespread is education on slavery in the South?
It wasn't taught it was taught in school just little, just the surface.
Okay.
So it wasn't even enough for me to teach my kids anything about it. But when I started working at the Whitney, I've learned so much in myself. It was almost that I was being taught myself of what was going on. I was saying to myself, when I read certain things, I was like, I didn't know this happened. I didn't know this happened. So it was like what I learned, I put it in other people, trying to teach it to them. And like Ali was saying about these children, a lot of them come that they don't know. They really don't know, and you teach it to them and they get interested in, what you talk about, because it's like some things that you tell them and just make them stop and like, wow, but they don't know.
Has the education around this topic gotten better over the years, or are we still far away from from the
I think
education?
honestly, myself, I think we fall away from it because of the curriculum. They teach them different things and they mostly leave it out, you know. But they get a lot. If we can get enough of them at the Whitney, they'll get a good bit of it.
Which is a good thing about Whitney as well.
Mhm.
You know, we get a lot of our school groups start off with the teacher visiting
Mhm.
and saying, I have to bring my kids back here.
Yes,
Kids, I definitely have to get my kids back here. And so
right.
that's another good thing about Whitney.
Oh, sorry, Ali, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
War,
Oh, there we go. We can
was over. And I had the benefit, my mama was a teacher for over 30 years.
Mhm.
And so I had the benefit also of her being a sharecropper's daughter, being big on education and always in your ear about, you know, your grandfather walked to work with no soles in his boots, right? You know, your grandfather can't remember if he ever went to third grade. You know, your grandfather's biggest brag is that all his kids either went to the military or went to trade school or went to college because he never did. You know, to see my aunties and uncles when the insurance man would come around to do my grandfather's policies and stuff, and to see my grandfather just put a little mark on the paper, and then one of his children signed their name on side of it because he couldn't read or write his own name. You know, and so I had the benefit of that. You know, my mama being an educator of always trying to tell you something about your history and how hard your people had it before you.
Mhm.
My family on my mama's side is one of the few families that actually was given land by the plantation that they worked on. My grandfather, as they say in those days, my grandfather had a lot of stroke from his job on the plantation and all the years that he worked there. And so we own actually a street called Al.
Wow.
He done froze up.
Technology.
Now my grandfather,
It's called.
for some reason, okay, there you go.
Oh, he's back.
Okay, I'm sorry, y'all.
Okay.
Podcast. But he would a plot of land to each one of his sons as they graduated high school and got married. He'd give them a piece of his land. And so today it's still called Albert Street. And so I have a good idea of some things that went on. You know, my mama's oldest sister I just went and talked to her the other day. She's like 89 years old. And, you know, when you have the benefit of people of that age that can tell you, you know, hey, at this time,
Oh, I feel like that was the most important part of the story.
Mhm. We're making repeated.
and when he got paid, he gave his mama all of his money, you know, because he would tell us, y'all got your little job. You don't even offer your mama a Pepsi when you get paid. You know, when I was working, I had to give my mama my whole paycheck. Everything I made, I gave to my mama. You know, to hear him say getting drafted to Vietnam saved his life. Because he knew if he just survived that war, he could come home and marry my mama and provide a life for a family. And so I did have the benefit of hearing things in the house, you know, and getting some of the history in the house about what my people endured growing up. And then to come to Whitney and just be able to build on that.
Right.
Because I've been over 5 years. I can tell y'all right now, every day I go to work, I learn something new.
Mm-hmm. True.
And the history surrounding slavery is so large like that, it's like a never-ending process.
True.
There's
Mhm.
always something else that you can learn and that can be added to it. That's just how big it is.
Right.
But it varying so much from place
Mhm.
to place, you know, under the Germans or under the French or under the English, the different variations and stuff. And so There's not a day that goes by that you can't pick up one of those books in there and start reading and find new information.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that second last question, as an American and as a North American, what do you think this history currently means to the United States and to the region? I think you've touched on it on different pieces a little bit, but why is this still important today?
As I said earlier, we can't solve modern day problems if we're ignorant of one another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so everybody learning and knowing something about everybody else makes it easier, you know, to be solve whatever problems we're facing today. You know, I've heard people on the site say things like, "Oh, just get over it," you know, and then they take the tour and, you know what? I'll never say that again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it comes out of ignorance. If we are ignorant of one another, it makes it extremely hard for us to come together and try to work on any kind of conclusions, come to any sort of compromise, come to any kind of solution. And so, as I said, this history, everyone's history should be, you know, a part of our curriculum. It should be learned, because just getting that ignorance out the way of one another makes it easier for us to communicate with each other and to solve our current problem. A lot of things that we deal with today come as a result of this history. Us not knowing the history, regardless of your skin color, us not knowing the history makes it that much harder for us to come to some kind of conclusion or solution for those problems today.
Wow. Harriet, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes. As our visitors come to the Whitney Plantation, we don't want them to forget. Like we say, lest we forget, we don't want them to forget their history. So at the end of my tour, after I give the tour, I always tell them, reach one, teach one. And that'll keep us and help us not to forget the history. Reach one, teach one.
We heard a quote a lot. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Right. And we don't want it to be repeated. That's right.
Right. That's something we say also a lot in Holocaust education, and in any type of historical education about tragedies, oppression.
This is how definitely teaching the history and knowing the history is how you prevent it from happening again.
And even not necessarily in the same way, but perpetuating it in different forms.
Correct.
I always use this example with the young people when I'm trying to tell them why it's important that they learn the history and how learning the history prevents, is that if you look at any instance of oppression in human history, it starts with dehumanization. And when you know the history, you know how to spot that dehumanization when it starts. You know, and like I tell them, because it doesn't start big. You know, they don't just come out and say, hey, those people ain't human. You know, they start with little small things, and then it balloons, it gets stepped up into something bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you are aware of this and you know the history in these different instances, how it was done, then when it starts happening in modern times, it's easy. Alarm bells go off. You know, this is the beginning of dehumanization. This is the beginning of a system of oppression. And that becomes a tool in fighting future instances. Like you said, if we don't learn the history, we definitely doomed to repeat it. You know, a big way of combating that is to educate, especially our young people, on these instances of oppression, you know, where they see how these steps were taken, how this took place. And that way they're able to spot it when it begins to happen again.
For sure. Wow. Final question. What is the message that you want us to leave this talk with? Who wants to go?
I might have answered mine too quickly. Reach one, teach one.
A good one.
Very short and sweet.
I love that. And I love that we can teach students that this is all they have to do. It's not such a big thing to, you know, change the world. Reach one, teach one, right? Each person has a part in that.
Right, right.
I just would double down on what Harriet said and what you just said. It starts off with everybody doing something. You know, we often think we just gotta go out and tackle the whole problem by ourselves. Right. It's not usually how things get done. If you pay attention to the ants, they get a whole lot done because it's a whole bunch of little tiny ants, but everybody's got a focus and everybody's getting something accomplished, got a little task, and they're completing that task. Their focus is on that task. Right. And I got some ant piles in my yard that prove it. Are capable of doing a lot. And so the same thing goes for us as human beings. If everybody does their small part.
Right, right. And I see a lot of people that reaches out through Instagram and Facebook. You see a lot of people talk about how they went to the Whitney and you need to go and what it's like. So that just like you know, just over and over repeating what people see and they come out. And so many people come out just from that, just from the advertisement. But it is so, I wish you can come back. I wish you all can come and see. It is outstanding. Yes, it is very outstanding.
The next time you're in the New Orleans area, please go, definitely check it out. It's pretty amazing. And it really seems from hearing you speak that what you're doing is so unique, even in the region, that the education that you're providing is so transformative and so unique.
Right.
So like I said, you both made a very strong impact on me, and you stayed past, I think, when the museum closed to talk to me and answer some of my questions. I'm glad that I got to come back and ask more. And I'm really grateful. We're all really grateful to hear you share some of your stories today. I'd like to open the floor now for the last bit of our time together. For our community here, for people who are watching, to be able to ask questions to you both and to Ashley, the executive director of the Whitney Plantation, if she is here right now. They currently have multiple events going on. Yes, she is here at the exact same time. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat box or unmute yourself. Okay, I think we have a question from Fran.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Jordana. First of all, I just want to commend both of you, Ali and Harriet. Your passion is something else. And the way you described your experiences really ring true, I think, to many human beings in this world. I think everybody has a history, and your description of what you knew and of what you've learned has been tremendous. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you so much. I wish I could get to Louisiana, but not too time soon, and all the best.
A little harder now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We would love to hear more questions. Here we have something in the chat. We have a question. Is this your full-time job, working at the Whitney Plantation?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Wonderful.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Another question. How do people use music to keep their spirits up and teach their children about their culture?
To my understanding was during slavery, they sung a lot to keep their spirits up. And it's like in the song was a message as well.
Yeah. Music played a big part in the enslaved people's lives. And of course, it's one thing that's never taken from them. When you stripping those native things, that's one thing that was never taken from them. And as Harriet just said, it becomes a way of passing messages and information amongst one another. And so music was a very integral part in holding on to the native culture. You know, the drumming. Then also for production, keeping the cadence, the work cadence in the fields and stuff. And so, yeah, music was very important to the enslaved people, being one thing of their native culture that wasn't taken from them.
Amazing. It's another form of resistance, like we were speaking about before.
Right.
We have a question. How many people go through the plantation yearly? Or about, maybe this is
That's a me question.
Ashley.
Yeah. We had in 2019 106,000. We've been having so we've only been open since 2014, so the visitation has been steadily climbing. We were expecting 2020 to be 115, but so we did 35,000 I think last year, 2/3 of which was in the 10 weeks before COVID. So it's been steadily climbing back. I'm not sure exactly what to expect, and I'm not sure exactly when we could expect to rebound completely. But our benchmark is kind of about 100,000.
Oh, we have another question here, which may also be for Ashley to answer. Are there any biographies of an enslaved person from the plantation that you guys have?
No, there are no first-person accounts of anyone who was enslaved at the plantation. However, I'm going to put a link in the chat. There was, and this is also addressing the music question, there was a man who was born at Whitney into a third-generation plantation family in 1908, and his name was Joe Joseph, cousin Joe Joseph. And he became a quite well-known blues musician. And there's actually a biography of him, and we have an oral history of him. We used some archival audio of his experiences working on the plantation in our audio tour. And so there is this is the biography that's about him. And you can also watch YouTube videos of him playing blues. And he described, and in another oral history that we had, people described singing work songs in the fields. And Whitney Plantation, and he describes it in this book, but I've also found news articles about it. There was a juke joint at Whitney Plantation way long time ago. We're talking like 1890 to 1920, where they played music that would have been kind of, plantation blues.
Wow. Okay, so we have a question. Was there any person or organization that tried to advocate for the people who were working on the plantation, even up to 1975, to help them not get stuck into debt, basically help them have an exit plan from working there? And then also, what finally made the plantation close? So I think this person is asking, were there any advocates that were trying to help, in this process, and then why did it close?
So the first answer is kind of no, but so this is. I'm going to try to answer this very briefly because there's a way to answer this very, very long, and I'm not going to try to get into it. But basically, the sugar planters in Louisiana were incredibly powerful. They were essentially a cartel. And so it was extremely difficult for plantation workers after slavery to unite. And also a lot of unions that existed were discriminatory. So they were, explicitly barred Black people from joining the union. The one exception to that is the Knights of Labor. And there was a little union activity in St. John Parish with the Knights of Labor. But basically the sugar planters put down those strikes. The last really violent strike repression of sugar planters was in Thibodaux in 1887, an event called the Thibodaux Massacre. And after that point, That's basically the end of any kind of organization among sugarcane workers. There's a little bit of union activity, interestingly enough, pairing with the church. Church leaders, nuns and priests were very, very involved in labor organizing in the 1960s. So there's another later push in the 1960s. And there was an organization called the Southern Mutual Help Association in New Iberia, which I'm actually still exists. I'm on the board of directors for. And they formed intentionally to get workers off of plantations and address some of these kind of multi-generational legacies that Ali and Harriet have talked about. Illiteracy being really key because, you know, deep into the 60s, people were undereducated, and also dealing with health issues because they had documented very poor health outcomes for people who were plantation residents. So there definitely were some organizations. There was kind of an expose in the 1970s in New Orleans where they ran this series of articles, but the people in the city didn't even know that people were still working on plantations. So even within this area, you know, the reason why there's not a lot of advocacy is because there wasn't really a lot of awareness of this issue. And the plantation shut down, like many of them, 1975, because the last owner died. And so it kind of went into the descendants had to figure out what to do with it.
Wow. Fascinating. Okay, we have a couple more questions, and then I think we're gonna call it a night. How many enslaved people worked at the Whitney plantation? I'm guessing the question is from start to finish. Ashley, do you have the answer to that around how many people were enslaved?
Is it 101?
In 1860.
101?
But then in the total time period.
Who owns the transplantation now?
It is a nonprofit, so we don't have an owner.
And two more questions. So with so many symbols and statues of slave related, that are slave related, being removed these days, have you had any pushback to remove the enslaved people's cabins? Has there been any kind of move to, or even really to get rid of anything on the plantation? Has there been any moves for that?
So I think one thing that's important to understand about what's being removed and what people are making action about is that those are symbols of white supremacy. So the attacks on Confederate memorials is really a concern with the public memorialization of the Confederacy and the Lost Cause narrative, which was perpetuated by post-bellum organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy way after the Civil War, so 1890s through the 1940s. And they're often put up in these kind of hotspot moments of civil rights gains as a method of, you know, instilling some kind of historical remembrance about this white supremacy that kind of underpins Southern society. So calls to remove Southern monuments to the Confederacy that's a very different conversation than what people think about slave cabins, if this makes sense, right? So a slave cabin is not a monument to white supremacy, right? It is the slavery is a product of white supremacy very much, right? But these are also spaces that, especially at Whitney Plantation, are understood to be places where we can remember the lives of people who went before. And we can center the stories of enslaved people, which is what we do. So I don't think anyone would ever ask us to remove slave cabins there. I think they'd be quite mad if we did, right? Because what we do is we remember their stories and we tell their stories and we talk about their culture and we make sure that those stories still stay alive. And so I am all for removing every monument to the Confederacy because it's a trash cause anyway. So take them all down. But, you know, I think that we need to keep these spaces that help us remember our past in this really important way, especially when we can flip the narrative.
Honor that 100%. Last question, Ashley, how did you become interested in this topic and arrive at your position?
I am once again going to have to give you a 25-cent version answer.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been at Whitney. It's kind of two different questions, right? I've been at Whitney since the beginning. I found out it was opening, and this has kind of always been my academic concern about slavery and African American history. And I'm a museum administrator, so this is kind of the, my skill set. And so I kind of pitched myself as someone who could reasonably do this. I was wrong in retrospect. I've kind of grown into it, but didn't know what I was getting into. Running an organization of this size and hiring the entire staff.
And you're doing well.
Oh, thank you. This is my old friend. So, okay. So, but in terms of, how I got interested in the topic. So what I used to say when people ask this question, because I understand I'm a white lady and, that seems confusing. But what I used to say is that I've always been interested and I don't know why. It's, I started, the first book I remember reading of my own volition was a slave narrative. It was Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I stayed up all night and I read it when I was 10 years old. But now that I think about it harder, in the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about this question differently. And I realize, and this goes back to something Harriet said, that I had very, very influential Black teachers when I was young. And when I was in 4th grade, I had a Black teacher, Mrs. Davis, and she, taught us about African American history. And we had a class project where I learned what segregation was, and I learned about the history of my town in North Carolina. And, that paired with, just growing up in the South and kind of seeing the products of segregation and slavery all around me everywhere and always being interested in history. And then having a series of other very influential Black teachers who, it exposed me to various, Black literary culture and things like that. That made a huge difference in my life. And my college professor, my advisor in grad school, interestingly, just presented on a panel about how important it is to teach about the diaspora to white students, because, they can go off and do other things with it. And he's using me as an example of that. So I really have to credit those people who were incredibly influential in my life and taught me about things that I wouldn't have necessarily been exposed to otherwise.
We all have a part to play in sharing this history and getting involved. So one last slide we're going to bring up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening and coming to hear Ali and Harriet and Ashley speak. Like I said, this was such a meaningful experience for me to visit the Whitney Plantation. I think actually the most powerful part was the children's memorial. I can't remember. Is that what it's called? The Children's Memorial?
Or Field of Angels.
The Field of Angels.
Yeah.
The Field of Angels. That was definitely the most powerful part for me. Even actually looking on the list of children who had died in that time, and some of them, it doesn't even have names there. It just has, little child, like around 5 years old or 3 years old or whatever it was. That was so powerful. And speaking to you guys, like I said, was so powerful. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us. And I think we can all walk away with so many messages from this that we can use in our everyday lives. Before everyone leaves, I would love to just point out the next event that we're going to be having with ShadowLight, which is on May 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And it's about the story of the Russian army, of the Soviet army during World War II, and specifically Jewish soldiers in the Soviet army, which is going to be a really interesting discussion about basically the Allied forces, Jews and the Allied forces liberating Jews in the camps and others that were in the camps during the Holocaust, and what it was like to be a member of
Jordana, you're frozen.
oh, and what it was like to be a member of the Jewish minority in the Soviet army at that time. So we're going to be shedding light on that story. And thank you again. Please join us at our next event, and I hope that we'll be able to work with the Whitney Plantation more at a later date. And everyone, please go visit the Whitney Plantation when the borders open, and when flying is allowed again, and when health is a little better. So be safe, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today.